All right, let's dive into the world of phase one clinical trials. Um, that very first time a new drug is given to humans, big moment. Like it's a huge step in the whole process of taking it from the lab to potentially, becoming a treatment. I'm sure there are a lot of questions about this stage. What really happens, who's involved, and how do researchers make sure safety is the top priority?
Well, I think what's really interesting about phase one trials is that they kind of set the stage for everything that follows in drug development. Of course, there's always that hope for some early hints that the drug might actually work, but the main goal is to get that crucial safety data.
So it's more about is it safe
Mhm.
than does it work at this
Yeah,
point?
exactly. It's all about understanding how the drug behaves in a human body, looking at possible side effects, figuring out safe dosage ranges, and tracking how it's processed, which is, the whole field of pharmacokinetics.
Pharmacokinetics. That's one of those words that might need a little bit of explaining. What exactly does that involve?
Okay, imagine you're tracking a tiny submarine, like navigating through the human body, all its twists and turns. That's basically what pharmacokinetics is. We're mapping the drug's entire journey. Where does it go? How long does it stay there? How is it broken down? And how does it finally leave the body? Understanding this is key to figuring out the right dose and how often it should be given in future studies.
I love that analogy. Makes it so much easier to picture what's going on. Now, I'm really curious about who actually participates in these trials. Who are these brave volunteers, and what are the ethical considerations
Oh,
involved?
absolutely. Informed consent is the most important thing here. Participants really need to understand all the potential risks and benefits before they even think about joining. A lot of times, phase one trials involve healthy volunteers, especially when the drug is expected to have, minimal side effects.
That makes sense. But what about trials for drugs that are designed for really serious conditions, like cancer? Are healthy volunteers involved in those too?
Not typically. In those cases, the participants are usually patients who have tried all other treatment options and are looking for something new, even with the risks. I mean, these trials are run with a ton of caution, strict ethical guidelines, and very rigorous safety protocols.
Speaking of risks, one of the sources we looked at mentioned how sometimes side effects aren't fully discovered until a drug is already on the market. That must make those early safety checks even more crucial.
Oh, absolutely. It just shows how important it is to keep monitoring, even after the initial testing is done. And it also highlights how complex drug development is. It's not always easy to predict how a drug will behave in different people over a long period of time.
Yeah, definitely emphasizes the huge responsibility researchers have to keep patients safe every step of the way.
So how do these phase one trials actually work in practice? What does a typical protocol look like? Well, imagine this. Researchers are carefully planning and documenting every single detail, following all these standardized procedures to make sure everything is consistent and accurate. Like having a detailed blueprint that guides every single aspect of the trial, from choosing participants to collecting data. And remember those main objectives we talked about: safety, dosage, and getting that early human data. Each of those has to be addressed with specific ways of designing the study and collecting information.
So it's a very organized process, but are there ever times when the plan has to change, like during the trial?
Oh, definitely. Just like an architect might change their building plans based on, the land they're building on, researchers often adjust their protocols based on the specific drug and the people who are part of the study. There's this constant back and forth, feedback and adjustments as the trial goes on, making sure it gives us as much information as possible without compromising safety.
That makes sense. And speaking of adjustments, one of the sources talked about dose escalation as a really important concept in phase one trials. Can you explain what that is and why it's so important?
Well, think of it like this. It's kind of like testing the waters before you jump into the deep end. Researchers start by giving very low doses of the drug and then gradually increase them, watching carefully how the participants react at each level. This helps them figure out the maximum tolerated dose, the MTD. That's the highest dose you can give without causing too many side effects.
So it's about finding that sweet spot where the dose is effective but still safe.
Exactly. That's one of the reasons why close monitoring is so important throughout the entire phase one trial. Researchers are constantly gathering information, blood tests, what the patients are reporting, watching out for any warning signs that might mean they need to change the protocol. They're like detectives, putting together all the clues to understand how the drug affects the human body. Picking up where we left off, it's amazing how much importance is placed on these first in-human studies. It's not just about ticking off boxes for safety. It's about getting those first critical pieces of information that shape how a drug is developed from that point on.
Yeah, it's like stepping into the unknown. I
Yeah.
mean, before this, researchers are working with cells, tissues, maybe animal models. But a phase one trial is when you really start to see how a drug works with, the complexity of the human body.
Right. It bridges the gap between what we know in theory and how it actually works in the real world. And one of the things we were looking at, a podcast by a pharmaceutical scientist, they made a great point about how vital these phase one trials are for understanding the results of all the research that comes later. Like, imagine you're building a skyscraper. You have to make sure that foundation is strong before you even think about adding more floors.
That's a great way to put it. So let's talk about how these trials are designed. One of the sources mentioned real-world protocols. What does that mean for a phase one trial?
Well, it means these trials aren't just some theoretical exercise. They involve a lot of careful planning, standardized procedures, and a ton of documentation to make sure everything is done consistently and accurately. Remember those core objectives we talked about? Safety, dosage, and getting that initial data from humans? Each of those has to be addressed with very specific study designs and methods.
Sounds like a lot of moving parts.
It is, but there's this constant loop of feedback and adjustments as the trial is going on. Imagine it like a ship navigating. The navigator's always making course corrections based on the weather and currents. Researchers are doing the same thing, adapting their protocols based on the specific drug and the people who are actually participating.
So it's about being flexible, but still sticking to those high standards you mentioned.
Absolutely. And talking about flexibility, remember that key concept we touched on earlier, dose escalation, starting with those small doses and slowly increasing.
Right, like dipping your toes in before jumping in the pool.
Exactly. And as researchers are gathering data on how the drug is being absorbed and broken down, remember our submarine analogy, they can adjust the dosage as needed, always making sure they're aware of that maximum tolerated dose.
To minimize any risks to the participants, it's incredible how much work goes into figuring out the right dose.
It really is. One of the sources even mentioned a really interesting example of how just changing the way a drug is given, like going from an injection to a pill, can have a big impact on how much of the drug actually gets into the bloodstream.
Wow, so even what seem like small changes can make a big difference. It makes you realize just how much detail goes into designing these trials. We've been focusing a lot on side effects and dosage.
Huh?
What other types of data are collected in phase one? How do researchers actually track that submarine, the pharmacokinetics, as it moves through the body?
Oh, they use a whole bunch of techniques. We're talking blood tests, urine samples, even using really sophisticated imaging techniques that can actually visualize where the drug is going in the body. They're looking at how quickly it's absorbed, where it travels, how it's broken down, and how long it takes to be eliminated. It's like creating a detailed map of the drug's journey through the human body.
And all of that information helps to fine-tune the dosage and make sure the drug is safe.
Exactly. Remember, the goal is to find that perfect balance of efficacy and safety. And that pharmacokinetic data is a big part of achieving that.
Okay, so we've got this detailed plan, careful monitoring, and all this data being collected. But how do researchers know when they've learned enough from a phase one trial to move on to the next stage of testing? What are the key decision points?
That's where it gets really interesting. It involves a mix of data analysis, statistical modeling, and, expert judgment. Researchers are looking for clear patterns in the data, a good understanding of the drug's safety profile, and evidence that they've found a dose range that's safe and potentially effective.
So it's not just about gathering data. It's about understanding it and figuring out what it all means.
Yeah, you got it. And one thing that really stood out to me as we were going through the sources was the amount of teamwork involved. You have clinicians, statisticians, pharmacologists, ethicists, all these experts working together to make sure the trial is conducted safely, ethically, and with strong scientific principles. It's like a well-coordinated orchestra, each instrument playing its part to create a harmonious sound.
And all with the shared goal of pushing medical knowledge forward.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty inspiring when you think about it. As we wrap up part two of this deep dive, it's clear that phase one trials are an essential stepping stone on the path to developing new and potentially life-changing treatments. They really show human ingenuity, scientific curiosity, and the bravery of the people who volunteer to be a part of this process.
Well said. And in part three, we're going to shift gears and focus on the bigger picture. We'll look at how these trials fit into the whole drug development process and what the future might hold for this critical stage of research.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into phase one trials. We've learned so much about what happens in these first-in-human studies. from safety protocols to figuring out the right dose and understanding how a drug moves through the body. But now let's zoom out a little bit. How do these early trials fit into the whole big picture of developing new drugs?
That's a really important question. Phase 1 trials aren't just these isolated events. They really lay the foundation for all the clinical research that comes after. The data we get from these initial studies about safety, dosage, and how the drug interacts with the body, it all feeds into every decision made in the later stages of development.
So it's like phase one is setting the stage for the entire journey of developing a new drug.
Exactly. You can think of it like a map maker who's charting a completely new territory. The information they gather in phase 1, it guides researchers as they navigate that long and sometimes very difficult path towards getting a new treatment approved and available to patients.
Speaking of challenges, one of the things we read is that phase one trials are really important for deciding if a drug can even move on to those larger scale trials. What are the things that make or break a drug's chances at this stage?
It comes down to carefully weighing the risks and the benefits. Researchers are looking for clear proof that the drug is safe, that any side effects are manageable, and there are early signs that it's actually doing what it's supposed to do in the body. It's about building a strong argument for why this drug deserves more investigation.
So it's like a really thorough screening process, getting rid of the drugs that are either unsafe or just unlikely to be effective down the road.
Exactly. And that's crucial for protecting patients from taking risks that aren't necessary and making sure that the resources we have are focused on the most promising drugs. You see, drug development is a very long and very expensive process, and not every drug that looks good at the beginning will make it to the end. Phase 1 plays a really big role in making sure we're putting our effort into the treatments that have the best chance of success.
It's like having these checkpoints along the way, making sure the drug is moving in the right direction. But it's not just about safety and whether it works or not. One of the things that really stood out to me in our research was the sheer volume of data that's collected during these trials. It's mind-boggling to think about all those data points, all the pieces of the puzzle.
It's true. We're talking about huge amounts of information, everything from the results of blood tests to what patients tell us about their experiences. And it's the research team's job to sift through all of that data, to analyze it and make sense of it, and to try to understand how the drug is behaving in the human body.
It's like a detective story, isn't it? Piecing together clues to build a case for a drug's potential.
And just like a good detective story, there are often unexpected turns. Sometimes the data shows us things we didn't expect, and that means researchers have to change their approach or even rethink whether they should continue developing the drug.
So those phase one trials really are the starting point that influences everything that follows.
Absolutely. What we learn in phase 1 affects everything from how later trials are designed to how the drug is eventually marketed and prescribed, if it gets that far. It's like a chain reaction of knowledge, all starting with those first studies in humans.
That's incredible. It really shows how impactful these early trials are.
It does. And it reminds us that developing new drugs is a team effort. It involves a whole group of experts, doctors, statisticians, pharmacologists, ethicists, all working together to make sure the research is done safely, ethically, and following all the rules of science. It really shows what humans are capable of when they're dedicated to finding new and better treatments.
This has been an amazing journey exploring the world of phase one trials. We've uncovered so much about these intricate processes, the crucial decisions that have to be made, and the dedication of all the people who are involved. It's clear that these first in-human studies are absolutely essential in shaping the future of medicine.
It's been a pleasure diving into this topic with you. We hope you found it as interesting as we did.
And to everyone listening, if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, we encourage you to keep learning. There's a whole world of information out there, and you never know. You might just be inspired to become a part of this incredible world of scientific discovery yourself.